Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We'll get the Chiron hung up here sometime soon. All of our work here brought to you by our friends at Sporticulture. I am wearing the hat. We've got the magma lamp up glowing the purple. This is the purple magma coming out here. We're going to have the black magma for football season. Cord has promised me that, so we're looking forward to getting him on. He's got his own podcast as well out there at Walnut Springs, the great nursery out west of Baltimore, providing flowers for us on the set, as well as Sporticulture for you, and they're selling like hotcakes. Go to sporticulture.com. Luke Jones joins us now. Speaking of football and football season, and I had Jeff Zrebeck on over the weekend, one of your Keemosabis, also chatted with Brian Billick at length, and I'm trying to talk to as many football people as I can, and this is going to be the weirdest of weird because, like, there's going to be no sunburn for you this year, right? Like, no farmer tan, none of that stuff, no hay fever, no liberal use of SPF 30 for you on the backfields. It's all drone use now and following Ravens.com, just the way they want us to, right, Luke?
Well, we'll eventually get to that point come August 17th. So we're, a little less than a week away from that. But
they're going to let me come out. I haven't read the rules. I really don't know the rules. So what are the rules?
The way it sounds, media is not going to have any access to the building, as you could probably expect. But you will have access to be able to go watch practice, wear a mask, socially distance.
What if you have to pee? I'm going to ask that question right now.
Can
you ask that for me?
I can.
Hold on. Dear Chad Steele, what if I have to pee?
I'm guessing they'll probably have a couple porta potties or something like that.
That has been an issue with socially distanced, right? Like there have been places where, like, I pulled in going to Ocean City back in June. Not Ocean City. We're going to Rehoboth and Dewey. Mm-hmm. And there were places that were serving food that did not have their bathroom open. I'm like,
right.
I'm driving Ocean City. Like, where am I going to go?
Yeah.
My wife's like, oh, I know where you can go. You should worry more for me. So anyway, they just, COVID issues. I mean, just, like malls have, just places I've been. It's like, where do you go to the bathroom if they don't want me going in the bathroom? So anyway, if I can't come in the building, it's just a little problem. It's not Kevin Burns' problem anymore. We brought that.
Sure.
That was last month. We brought that up. So.
Yeah, very true. But it's definitely different. I mean, we're now a month out from the start of the season, and we've yet to watch a training camp practice. The players themselves are only going through walkthroughs at this point. We know the first preseason game was supposed to be later this week, right? I mean, that's where we are, but no preseason. So you have this. And I'm not at all.
Well, they would be doing their scrimmages right now, too. In the modern vernacular, the Eagles or somebody be coming here and they'd be kicking it around like they've done with the Jaguars and the Rams and a whole bunch of other teams,
sure.
Right?
Sure. I mean, typically, the last few years, they've done a set of joint practices for the first preseason game. So it really is different in that way. And I'm not at all implying or suggesting that the start of the season is in jeopardy, but it's just a very different start to the season. And we talked about that a little bit when we were talking baseball, in terms of what to expect, in terms of quality of play, in terms of injuries. I think just how cohesive an offense or a defense looks, and that's why the Ravens having so much continuity with Greg Roman and Wink Martindale staying put. I mean, can you imagine, Nestor, if the Ravens were doing this whole revolution thing this year as opposed to last year when we were talking about how different the offense was going to be and Greg Roman coming in? Or how about being the Cleveland Browns with a brand new head coach, or other teams around the league with a brand new head coach? And these guys have just recently laid eyes on their players.
Yeah. Well, the Cleveland Browns better be worried about defense in the revolution on September 13th because I'm fired up for football. Is that better?
Yeah, there you go. I like that spirit.
If you start to get me into it a little bit, I mean, it doesn't take much. I mean, I am known sort of for my passion over the last 3 decades. But, yeah, I mean, there is that part of the competitive part of this. As much as we make fun of the baseball and how lousy it's been, quite frankly, the hockey's been lousy. The football, I know we've discussed this, and this is kind of the neat part of this because I've done sports radio for 30 years. I have to think about everything. What I thought last week might be very, very different this week based on this. And I think what I think differently this week, having watched 2 weeks of baseball now and bubble basketball and pod hockey and all of that, is if I'm John Harbaugh or if I'm Eric DeCosta or if I'm a football coach anywhere, I want to make sure we're not that we're the most prepared we can be given the circumstances. And that's why I like teams like the Ravens, maybe the Rams, teams that have won recently that have the same leadership top to bottom and the same leadership characters, the same Aaron Donalds and Jared Goffs and whoever their leaders are and their coaches are. If you've had it together the last 3 or 4 years, you're already ahead of 50% of the teams in the league, maybe getting up on 75%, right? For change and for coordinators, key players, I would think that the Houston Texans are a better organization in this environment because of their continuity and the way they've held it together than, let's say, the Jets or the Dolphins or anybody else that's just trying to figure this out.
Anyone that's been in disarray, anyone that's had some upheaval in terms of coaching turnover, personnel turnover, lots of players that have come and gone.
I think there's upheaval for the Chiefs just on winning. I think winning creates upheaval for them that makes, even though they're together and all, it's different for them. They come back, they got their shiny rings. They didn't really even get to go around town and doff their capas. They had lockdown 4 weeks after the Super Bowl, and they were getting tested to make sure they didn't pick it up in Miami, right? Literally.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought. I mean, I think it's, so much of this, and not to veer away from sports, but I think all of this has happened as individuals, not even getting into society as a whole, how it impacts you. I mean, you have individuals who knows the stories of some of these players where they had someone that got sick in their family or some, maybe they had just had family member that lost a job or lost a business.
I have a friend in the NFL who is sickle cell trait, which means that if he got COVID, he could die. And he doesn't want to die. And he's got money and he's not going to play. And I understand that. And when I hear people on the internet or see people talking about integrity and character of, this is the man test, this is the manly test for you to go play the gladiator sport in the middle of a pathogen. I don't think so, dude. I mean, for the same reason my wife and I are running around, the Wise Markets out in Perry Hall with Rob Santoni without masks on. I'm not doing it. I wouldn't expect anybody else would want to do it either, and I care about you and I hope that you're doing it. And therefore, I wouldn't say to you, well, Luke, it's just Sunday 1 to 4. Go down to the stadium without a mask with the WNST hat on. I've got you. Wink, wink. Everything's fine. I wouldn't do that to you as an employee. They're sort of doing that to their employees in sports right now. And that unto itself is its own issue, but it also brings up the who's going to be the cashier, who's going to drive the bus, who's going to go to work today, who feels safe and who doesn't feel safe, and who's watching which news channel and following which scientist.
Well, I wasn't really veering too much into that. It was more so when you're talking about these players, how everyone's going to respond individually is different. And this goes back to what we talked about.
Or what's going to make Cespedes clean his locker out and say, I just don't want to do this today. I don't want to do this anymore.
Well, and we saw what? I think that did the total end up being 69, 70 players that ended up opting out. And I'm guessing you're still going to have some players who will, at some point, something will happen, whether a circumstance with their family changes, something with their health might potentially
Oh, by
change.
the way, training camp's just hard in general. Guys come to training camp every year and say, tap out.
Sure.
Literally,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, and that's, that's one thing that's interesting. In fact, it was funny. I saw Deion Sanders had a tweet over the weekend that got a lot of attention. See, I interpreted it differently. I think a lot of people took it from him as saying, you're making a bad decision because, this is a business. They're going to play without you. I took it more as just beware that the league is going to move on without you. So guys that are making a choice that is absolutely within their right and should not be criticized, should be respected. But you and I both know very well that a number of the players who opted out from the NFL have played their last NFL snap. And guess what? A number of those guys might not have even made their roster. For every notable player who might have opted out, there were probably 8 or 9.
Luke, let me stop the show for you. Are you telling me the National Football League would blackball a player?
No,
you really
it's not.
Believe that?
No, it's not blackball.
Oh, I believe that. I mean, I believe. He's a little soft. He's a little soft.
I don't think it has anything to do with this.
I think that's what's said behind closed doors. He's a little soft.
I disagree.
I think that's been said about all sorts of players all the time.
I'm not saying I'm talking about fringe NFL players. I mean, Nestor, the average career in the NFL is 2 or 3 years. I'm talking about DeAnthony Thomas and Andre Smith for the Ravens. Let's call a spade a spade. Neither one of those guys were a roster lock. They
Camp
were on the
bodies.
bubble.
Right.
Andre's.
Yeah.
I'm not saying
Better
even
than
camp
that.
body.
Right.
They had a chance to make the team, but guess what? If you ask me to put $1 on whether they play again in the NFL or not, I'm going to bet against both of them at this point. And it's not because they're blackballed or blacklisted. It's because
I'm just saying the NFL does things like that. They do. They keep a little chart. And
I don't disagree with you on that.
So if you didn't have the belly to show up and play with your teammates, then we don't need you in Green Bay next year. We don't need that is part of it too. That if you opt out, the phone might not ring for you next year.
Generally speaking, yes, you're right. I don't think it. I think it's much more a case of if you're a fringe player who's away for the game for a year. I mean, think about it. Think how many fringe players have played for the Ravens and they don't catch on that next season when they're let go or they're on a free agent. They're gone then. They don't play anymore. I mean, that's kind of the way it works.
Not everybody gets lucky enough to get picked up like Alex Cintron and be a coach.
Yeah, right. But and part of it is also the reality of being away from the game for a year. I mean, this is a very physically demanding game. And again, for these guys that opted out, it's fine. But I took Deion Sanders' message there as
you might not be allowed to opt back in.
Yeah, I mean, it just might be that you may have been you may have just kind of unintentionally put yourself into retirement. You know, I mean, that's just the reality of it. But I think with all these players, bringing it back to what preseason is going to look like, what the season's going to look like. I mean, you have so many different guys who had so many different experiences in the offseason. And yes, some of them have opted out. The vast majority are saying at this point, I'm playing. But what was their offseason like? How much access did they have to facilities to be able to train? A personal trainer, which so many of these players have. I know the Ravens and Steve Saunders, their strength and conditioning guy who kind of heads up their off-season workout program. They did remote workouts at different times of the day, different time zones. They sent equipment to players all across the country. But again, did every other team do that? So I think this kind of goes back to what you said as far as the continuity issue, but I think also the teams that maximize the resources. And we've talked about that with sports science. We've talked about that with the Ravens being one of the teams that have really taken a leading role in embracing analytics. I think all of those teams who did everything they absolutely could to try to maximize their time, to try to get everything they possibly can out of, whether we're talking remote workouts, whether we're talking about ways to help players social distance, which I know they're wearing trackers around the facility that will beep if you get within 6 feet of someone. Or the teams that are going to every length to not just manage the virus, but clearly that's an enormous part of this, but also to just try to maximize and embrace everything that's different about this, but to try to make it as good as it can possibly be. And to understand that, yeah, this isn't the normal NFL season. The teams that do those things and clearly have a requisite amount of talent, they're going to be the teams that are most successful. I mean, the teams that manage the virus the best and the teams that clearly have, you know, if you're the least talented team in the league and all you're doing is not testing positive for the virus, I'm not saying you're going to go 14-2, but the teams that are able to manage all of that and lean into the fact that, yeah, this is weird, but guess what? We're going to make the best of it. And we're not going to sit here and lament and say, woe is me, and we can't have our normal meetings in the auditorium. We'll have Zoom chats, or we're going to meet outside where guys can spread out, and we'll have John Harbaugh on a megaphone. You know, I mean, whatever it ends up being, the teams that are able to embrace how weird this is, how unusual it is, they're going to be the teams that have the best chance of being successful. And then if you can maximize that and offset the limitations in that way, then it comes down to Sundays. And at that point, the football part of this takes over. And when you look at the Ravens specifically, other than maybe the Kansas City Chiefs, they're in as great a position as anyone in the league. And I'd take them against anyone in the league. So that's where, if you are a Ravens fan, and you know, we can certainly get into how different it's going to be and not being able to go to games, not being able to go to training camp, but that's where you can still have some excitement over this, understanding that, yeah, there's some very tenuous aspects to this that we don't know exactly how it's going to go.
Well, I was always pissed that the Orioles took my press pass away. Still am. It's still wrong and all that. But if the Ravens took my practice pass away, I'd be okay with that. You can't see practice. No, please don't take practice away. So for that, I'm not lost and lonely, as you know. You enjoy the sweat and the whistle and the 7-on-7. You enjoy that more than I do, just from a spectacle of it. On the backfields, and I know fans enjoy that. I think for the fans missing out on all of this, there's a level of engagement that now the Ravens get their dream, Michelle Andres, of running Ravens.com in a complete bubble, that the only eyes and ears are that of what we see coming from the inside out. I'm fascinated as a 52-year-old guy that 2 or 3 years from now, hopefully surviving this, that I'll get together over a beverage with John Harbaugh and really ask about some of this, because how the 32 teams are managing it, it's not best practices, I wouldn't think. Nobody's sharing how they're doing this because it is such a competitive advantage, right? So how Pete Carroll is doing it in Seattle is going to be different than how Sean Payton's doing it in New Orleans. And with the amount of money these coaches make, with the amount of money these teams have available to them to cordon things off, this is where the Marlins get sloppy for me, and the Cardinals, and how stupid baseball was, and how brilliant sort of basketball has been at least trying to pull this off. That bubble to bubble, city to city, Owings Mills to, the Philadelphia bubble in Philadelphia, next to their stadium, where the facilities are, how it's managed, how the leaders manage this and how they deal with this psychologically, how adept Lamar Jackson is to this social distancing thing, how seriously he takes the mask and keeping it away from himself and his mother, and then that times 100 people in your organization from a crisis management standpoint. And Luke, I'm going to make a joke here because I've already talked about the Dolphins being FUBAR and their owner being FUBAR, and the way they've done business for the last, since Shula, right, since Marino, has been a mess. But think about them last year. They came together and they practiced, and they had a coach and they had a quarterback, and they all got together. They had a home game, and they played against the Ravens in week 1. It was 51-0. What was this? I don't even remember what it was, right? But whatever it was such an incredible embarrassment. And the Ravens were trying out the revolution for the first time, and they had all of their normal things put in. Everybody was working under normal conditions, and there still was a 50-point difference between the – and I'm wondering, what the hell is going on in Berea right now that's going to allow the Browns to compete with the Ravens, other than if Orlando Brown goes out and gets wings tonight and gets COVID and brings it back to the whole team, which is a concern for everybody, right? It's a concern for every team.
Sure.
I'm looking at the Ravens from a talent perspective and the way they run things and the advantages that they have that are built into this. There are facilities in the woods. The players all live in one community that's sort of in the woods, that they literally could avoid a lot of people because they're in the woods. That's different than driving into downtown Philly, I think, from the way the Eagles are going to do this. And I just know that, or the way that the Bengals are going to do this, where they drive into the city, or the Panthers, different teams, and the way they're going to manage it, and their general capabilities and ineptitude or proficiency, organization to organization. And for that, if the league plays, I love that the Ravens will be one of the better teams as long as Lamar doesn't get broken in half, which was a week-to-week concern every Sunday last year, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even to take it a step further, you mentioned some of the setups of these organizations with their training facilities, but how about just region of the country? There are regions of this country where the virus has been not completely contained, but they're certainly doing better than other regions. So, I mean, there are so many factors at work here, and it really does come back to what I said. The organizations, clearly talent matters. We know that. The Ravens are a very talented football team.
And leadership
too.
matters, as the Browns would tell you last year.
Right. I was just going to say the leadership and continuity at the top is just going to be of the utmost importance. And I will throw this out because I asked John Harbaugh this a couple weeks ago, because I asked him, even though it was a totally different circumstance as far as the calls, but think back to the 2011 lockout. No spring workouts whatsoever. They had their first and second round draft picks in, and they had a press conference, and that was the extent of the contact they had with Jimmy Smith and Torrey Smith that year. they didn't see their rookies, they didn't see their veterans until training camp. Remember, the CBA didn't get agreed upon until what, July 25th, something like that. So I asked John Harbaugh, what, if any, lessons that you took away from that experience can you apply to this? And he basically cited, well, my brother Jim was a first-year head coach for the 49ers that year, in the same way that you can think of any first-year head coach this year, and they went to the NFC Championship game. But generally speaking, and this is where I speak for myself and not John Harbaugh talking, those teams that have new programs in place, whether it's a new head coach, new GM, new offensive coordinator that's wanted to revamp the system, new D coordinator wanting to revamp what kind of defense they're going to play. I mean, you just think how behind the eight ball they are. I mean, just it's one thing to have Zoom chats, and look, that's what most of us, that's how you and I have interacted since March. We were on the phone or texting or via Zoom. We haven't been in person together since mid-March. But there is definitely a different element to being with someone in person, even if it's 6 feet away, that these teams that have new leaders, new head coaches, new OCs, new DCs, new GMs, it is a different element when you're showing up together in late July and you're just now getting on the field in a walkthrough setting compared to the Ravens or the Chiefs or, I would say the Patriots, but they've had so much turnover from a player standpoint. New Orleans, go look at Pittsburgh, look at every team that has established head coaches and GMs. They have such a huge advantage. And I think even the culture, even the messaging within the locker room. I mean, the Ravens, what they added was a Calais Campbell, who is one of the most respected players in the league, on top of guys that they already had, veterans, and even guys like Lamar, who are really young, but he's respected as a leader in that locker room.
Who's going to play guard, by the way? Speaking of leaders, there's no Yonda, right?
You know what? I mean, it's funny you asked that.
It's my first football question of the year, by the way. Congratulate myself.
I know, right? How are we supposed to know at this point? I mean, I don't know if John Harbaugh could really tell you. I think.
Boy, he's glad he retired, isn't he, Yonda?
Oh, no
he looked
question.
happy, and he lost 50 pounds in the first 6 weeks. And we saw him as like, there's Flacco, and like, that's the last time I was in a room with you, I think, right?
Yeah, it was. No, that you're absolutely right. But as far as I think what's interesting with the right now that we're getting into some actual nuts and bolts of the roster and the team, I think what's interesting about the right guard spot is we don't know if it's just going to be the right guard spot. What happens at center if Matt Skura, who looks to be on track to be practicing during training camp, he's on PUP right now, but it sounds like he's closer to practicing than not. But what if he gets out on the field and that knee, he's healthy enough to play, but he's not the same Matt Skura? What does that mean? They've already talked about the possibility of Bradley Bozeman sliding over to center. If he does that, who plays left guard? Under that scenario, you're talking about potentially all three interior spots having a different starter than last year.
No Alex Lewis here anymore, right?
Right. But I mean, I think they have a number of interesting candidates, starting with, I mean, DJ Fluker being the veteran that they brought in post-draft. He started a lot of games in the league. He's not great by any stretch of the imagination. And PFF has kind of had him as a mediocre starting caliber right guard, but he raises the floor at least. You know what you're going to get from him. He worked with Joe D'Alessandris in San Diego years back, so there is some familiarity there in that room. But Fluker's not really a high ceiling guy. In a perfect world, you'd love Ben Powers going into year two after last year kind of being a redshirt year for him. You'd love to see him step in and be the right guard and play really well. And you say, okay, he's not going to be Marshall Yonda, but we think he can be our starter for the next 4 or 5 years. And that would be a great scenario for the Ravens. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that all plays out. And not that I think it's a source of panic. I think it's relative concern when you consider just how good and deep this roster is and how much really did come back. I think that interior offensive line is going to be interesting because that's a tricky spot to develop anyway. And we've heard coaches talk so much about the lack of OTAs and lack of hitting in practice. Well, now you talk about no spring workouts, and we talk so much about rookies and second-year players having that first full off season, how advantageous that is to their development. So no spring, and now no preseason games, which you might say a preseason game, yeah, that doesn't matter to Lamar Jackson or Marlon Humphrey or Earl Thomas, but it sure as heck matters to the younger guys on this team that need some reps and you're trying to evaluate as a coaching staff. So to not have that, how does that interior offensive line play out? Now, I'll say this. They still have Lamar Jackson, who absolutely is the X factor for the running game. They have a very good stable of backs. They have 2 Pro Bowl offensive tackles. So even if they struggle a little bit to find the right combination inside, I'm thinking they're still going to be okay, to put it, to state it mildly. But if you want to be fully calibrated and fully maximize this thing and to be right there with the Chiefs for the number 1 seed, you'd like to figure out that interior line sooner rather than later. So that's what's going to be challenging about these next 4 or 5 weeks to really try to figure that out. They are going to hit more in practice because they're not going to have preseason games, but the overall level of contact's not going to be what it normally is when you count practices, joint practices, and then the 4 preseason games. So to try to figure that out right now, I mean, I just gave you a long answer to say I don't really know right now, and I'm not so sure Joe D'Alessandris and John Harbaugh and Greg Roman.
And it's hard to figure out that without practice, without hitting other people.
And look, in a week when media is allowed to come out there for the full team training camp practices, it'll become apparent right away who they're at least thinking about. But even last year, and I'll remind everyone of this, early on in training camp last year, who was playing left guard? They had Ben Powers working there, and primarily it was Jermaine Illuminor. Well, we remember what happened. Illuminor gets traded to the Patriots, and they were kind of sick of him, and he couldn't stay on the field, and they didn't really love him as a player at that point. They saw talent, but it wasn't really coming together.
Someone might have called him soft in the organization.
Maybe, but then they put Bradley Bozeman in there right towards the last 2 weeks or so of the preseason, and he took the job and ran with it. And he wasn't a Pro Bowl talent there, but he was rock solid there. And
but he came from a program where he knew how to work too. I mean, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And that's part of how they draft these guys is that, if he ever does get it, he'll get it because he's working hard.
Well, and that's where you do look at some of the young guys and you say Ben Powers, who played at Oklahoma and played a lot there. He didn't play. The only game action he got last year was Week 17, the Steelers game. That was a glorified preseason game. Played pretty well, but we don't know a whole lot about him. But Bradley Bozeman, who played more than Powers did, year 1 did not look like a guy that you said automatically, oh, he's going to be a starter. Well, if Ben Powers if he's put in the work on his own and has put in the film study work and he's worked on his technique and he's maximized the remote work he's been able to put in with the offensive line coaches, then maybe he steps into right guard and not going to be Marshall Yanda. None of these guys are going to be Marshall Yanda, but can he step in and be a rock solid player that coaches aren't thinking about when they go to sleep at night and worrying about? Then that's great. But they have him, they have Ben Bredesen, they have Tyree Phillips. Don't forget about Patrick McCarry. I mean, I think he's kind of the forgotten guy here, whether it's at center or maybe at guard. Kid played really well for Matt Skura at the end of last year. I mean, a difficult circumstance for him being thrown in.
We didn't mention his name, which means he was incredible, right?
Exactly. It
wasn't his fault we lost to the Titans.
Well,
right?
I mean, he struggled in that game, but guess what? A lot of guys struggled in that game. That's why the Ravens lost. So they have some options, but trying to figure out who the best option is going to be. Do you lean a little more veteran-laden, like a DJ Fluker, who has experience and maybe doesn't have the highest ceiling, but he's got a higher floor because you generally have an idea of what kind of player he is, considering he's been in the league so long? Or do you go with a younger guy and say, you know what, we might have a couple hiccups early on, but we're still going to be a dynamic, great offense. Even
that's where they went with Zeus, right? When they put Zeus in, it was, he'll figure it out, and he did.
Yeah,
and once they put him in there, to your point, it was similar with Skura, similar with all these guys, is until they put Bradley Bozeman in there and said fly, and they've had flops as well at various points too, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, when you're talking about mid to late round picks or even an undrafted free agent like McCarry, there's always an expectation that the guy isn't good. Let me rephrase that. There's a very real fear that they're going to be in over their head because they weren't a first-round pick. Or even in Orlando Brown's case, a third-round pick, where you still think of second- and third-round guys as being, okay, maybe not day-one starter, but a guy that we'd like to see eventually become a starter. Anyone drafted after that, it's much more of a skeptical, questioning, doubting kind of attitude you have. So to your point with some of the guys they've thrown in there, I mean, Bradley Bozeman, he played, he was solid last year. And I got so many questions the first 6 or 7 weeks of the season on Twitter, like, is he still going to be the guy? Is there someone, you know, when is Ben Powers going to take over for him? Because Ben Powers was a 4th-round pick. And I kept saying, well, you know what? I think the team's a little more confident in him than outsiders are. And Matt Skura was a great example of that a couple years ago. So, you know, until we really see it, and we'll get a better idea of this once media's allowed to watch practices. And you know, but even then, they're still going to be unknown. As I mentioned, for most of training camp last year, it looked like Jermaine Illuminor was the favorite, and then they traded him and they went with Bozeman, and Bozeman started 16 games and did a nice job. So there's plenty of unknown, and that includes the coaches. And that's why I said John Harbaugh probably could give you his best idea right now. Joe D'Alessandris would give you his best idea of what the interior line is going to look like. Same with Greg Roman. But until it plays out over these next few weeks, and until they start hitting and having some live scrimmaging and things of that nature in practice, there's going to be a lot of unknown, and probably more unknown going into the season than normal because of the lack of preseason games.
He's Luke Jones. He's Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net. Together, we get together and do this. We talk sports. We've been doing a lot of Baltimore Positive stuff. We're going to be merging the WNST and Baltimore Positive brands coming up. You will see that out on the web. I'll be talking about it out on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Snapchat and Instagram and everywhere we are. Luke's taking a little break from the ballpark, focusing on Owings Mills this week. The Orioles are running around. We got bubble hockey and Barry Trotz and the Islanders and the Capitals. I'll be doing more sports this week, but you can find them both at WNST.net, AM 1570, where we never stop talking Baltimore Positive.